Hello there, and welcome to AGRC 102 Animal Nutrition. This is Unit 1, Nutrients and Digestion, and this will be the first of a 4-episode series covering the Unit 1 content material, Nutrients and Digestion. There's a lot of information in this section. I'm going to break it down into 4 segments to try and make it more palatable to listen to. And it's important that you really key in on this first unit. The first unit serves as the foundation for the rest of the entire course, and also there's a rather large exam that comes right after this particular unit. So right off the bat, we've got to get these foundational materials down. So stick with me here as we go through this 4-episode series in Unit 1. But let's get to our content. You all can read the objectives here, but we're going to cover the 6 basic nutrients and talk about them and their application. Later on in the series, we're going to look at digestive systems, and then we've got to understand the difference in the monogastric and ruminants. And one that's not here is talk about nutrients and digestion a little bit as well. So let's get into the 6 basic nutrients, and the first one, most important, is water. Absolutely number one on the list whenever we talk about meeting nutrient needs. You have to make sure that you have adequate water. It's the most abundant need. It's the most important nutrient by far. And it's also the cheapest one typically. So, and there's some data here on the screen on the slide in terms of how much it constitutes. It's 90% of blood. And tissue is 70 to 90% water. And that changes a little bit as the animal matures. So the more mature an animal becomes, the less water is in the body, or less percentage of water that's in the body. Most people will overlook this as a key nutrient need, and key in terms of cleanliness, availability, things of that nature. We'll talk about this more as we go through, but it's a huge pet peeve of mine whenever you visit animal feeding operations and you find insufficient water accessibility or water that's really dirty. It's very difficult, and it has a huge impact on productivity. So it's important that you provide plenty of clean and fresh water. Next, when we look at how does water occur in the body and what is its forms? You'll find it intracellular, which is muscular and skin. Kind of the moisture that keeps your skin pliable, flexible. Extracellular water that's kind of floating around, basically buffering tissue like your cerebral spinal fluid and blood plasma and around in the lymph areas. And then of course water is the carrying material for everything in your gastrointestinal tract, and it's kind of the substrate that carries all the nutrients around in the GI, and also the substrate that allows for the removal of waste, whether it's urinary or digestive system waste. Functions, again, it's going to transport nutrient and excrement throughout the body, like we mentioned. It's really critical in terms of fostering chemical reactions. It regulates temperature, provides you your shape, lubricates a lot of the joints and muscles. So it's important for a number of different reasons. So what happens if we're deficient? Well, first things first is you will see a rather marked decrease in feed intake. It will cause the greatest decrease in feed intake is if you restrict water intake. Animals will then result with weight loss and become dehydrated very quickly. Within about 2 or 3 days, you'll start to see, if you restrict all water intake, you'll see dehydration occur within about 48 hours. And then you'll see increased excretion of nitrogen and electrolytes. And essentially what the body is responding by doing is harvesting water from the body in order to keep getting rid of the waste product that your body will create, and therefore furthering and making the dehydration and weight loss problem even worse. So that's what happens whenever you see water deficiency. So where can you get water? Obviously, the main source is drinking water, but certainly you're going to have some in ration water. There's a little bit of moisture in all of your feedstuffs except for minerals and vitamin packs that are essentially 100% dry. But even, alfalfa hay is going to carry, 10, 12, maybe 15% water, maybe a little bit higher than that if you, store it and treat it a certain way. Forages like corn silage are going to be 70% water. So there's some moisture that's going to be in other feedstuffs, but their primary water source is drinking water. And of course, temperature and humidity affects the amount that they'll drink. How much dietary water is there affects the amount of consumption that they will intake. What they're doing from a productivity standpoint affects how much that they'll drink. So if you have horses that are working hard in terms of working cattle or out trail riding on a regular basis, are going to consume more water than a horse that's just simply relaxing and grazing out in the back pasture. But water quality is really, really crucial, and animals will prefer clean, fresh water on a regular basis. And the consumption rates are down here. Pigs is about 2.5 to 5 gallons per day. Sheep between 1 gallon and 4 gallons. Cattle 8 to 16. And if we talk about cattle and lactation, it's 2 to 2.5 times that. So, for example, a lactating dairy cow might drink 50 gallons of water a day, no problem. Horses between 10 and 14 gallons, and poultry is about 2 parts water for every 1 part dry feed. It's kind of a ratio that the poultry rations provide. So, of course, I mentioned water that's in or on feed. Grasses and range. Your pasture is going to range somewhere from 8 to 30% water. Forages, like I said, 5 to 90%, and silage feeds 30 to 50% water, up to 70%, maybe on the high end occasionally, and a little bit from the amount of precipitation or dew that might be out on the pasture in the morning time or something like that. But that one in particular is rather insignificant. These here I, though, would mention, while they are important, it is critical to know how much water your animals are drinking on a regular basis and see if they're drinking right on track. So where do they lose water? Of course, via urination and fecal losses, but you do utilize and lose a good amount of water, just simple vaporization from lungs and through the skin. Simple, dissipation of heat via sweat, and especially if you look at horses that are big sweaters, when they're working and get warm, they'll sweat a lot. Cattle don't particularly sweat very much, if at all. They will lose water by panting. That's how they cool themselves. But those are your main water loss areas. Now, water is absorbed basically through every part of the gastrointestinal tract except for the esophagus. That's the only place that there's no water absorption capability. So whether we're talking about the rumen, the omasum, the ileum, the jejunum, the stomach, the cecum, the large intestine, water is absorbed, readily at any time through the digestive tract, basically, again, except for the esophagus, that there is no really absorption capability. The amount absorbed really varies by species and the diet and the amount of work and the amount of productivity that they have. If you have a diet with a high amount of indigestible dietary fiber, think about a diet with a high amount of straw in it or something like that. That, of course, can reduce the amount of water absorption because they're going to need to lubricate that digested to get out of the body. So that sometimes affects it a little bit. And if you have a lot of other things, toxins, stressors, things of that nature, can really also impact the amount of water absorption. Next, let's talk about carbohydrates, and just make a note of it here. Anytime you see the abbreviation CHO for me, that's referring to the carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen in carbohydrates. So anytime you see that abbreviation throughout the rest of the course now, just automatically think carbohydrate. And when we talk carbohydrates, we're talking about sugars, starches, cellulose, gums, all of those kind of things. And carbohydrate makes up about 3/4 of plant dry weight. So if you had a corn stalk standing next to you, about 75% of that is carbohydrate in some form, whether it's a sugar, a starch, a cellulose, a gum, etc. and important because we're going to figure out through the course how to use that corn plant and the grain, of course, that it produces to feed the livestock that we're going to talk about throughout the class. So we're going to classify. You see a lot of classification stuff through this course. We need to understand how to break down and what categories to pull things from in order to balance rations effectively. So we're going to classify carbohydrates by the number of sugar molecules that they have. The easiest one is monosaccharides. Very simple glucose, simple sugars. It's the most important sugar in animal nutrition, and it's the primary energy source. So when we talk about starches that's in corn, it's going to be broken down eventually to glucose, which is your primary energy currency. The other one in the monosaccharide category is fructose. Monosaccharides have the least amount of bonds in them, and so they are the most digestible and smallest molecule and easiest to absorb. Then, of course, you have disaccharides, which is sucrose, maltose, lactose, which is milk sugar, and those are, again, a wee bit more complex, so require a little bit more energy to break down. Then you get into your polysaccharides, and these are highlighted a little bit more here because, again, we're talking about starches. That's, again, that principal sugar in cereal grains, starch that gets broken down, like I mentioned in the previous slide, to then glucose, which is your primary sugar. And then cellulose, and cellulose is about 25 to 30% of fibrous plants, and it's the most abundant carbohydrate in nature. So again, picture that corn plant that I mentioned standing next to you. It's got a large amount of cellulose and hemicellulose in it. And the cattle that are out in the pasture, or your horse that's in the barn eating those forages, has to be able to figure out how to break down. Their digestive system is made specifically to digest those cellulose and hemicellulose fractions in order to harvest the carbohydrates that's in there and convert them to usable, productive sources, whether it's meat or milk. If you compare and contrast that a little bit with a human digestive tract, we're monogastrics. We consume salad on a regular basis. Lots of you are big salad eaters. Your monogastric digestive tract is actually quite poor at breaking that down. That's why lots of you, whenever you're trying to cut nutrients, eat higher fiber foods just like that, because it's harder for your stomach to digest and your body to harvest nutrients out of, and therefore less of it gets broken down and more of it passes through. Because your body just doesn't have a great way to break down cellulose and hemicellulose fractions. That's why you see a diet set up in that regard, and that's why ruminants are made to do exactly that. They can convert those lower quality feedstuffs, things that we can't eat, into food sources for us. So that's how that works. We also have to take a moment here and focus on a non-carbohydrate fraction. It fits right next to the carbohydrates. There's really not any energy, that's why it's called a non-carbohydrate, but it's in the same cellular structure, and that's lignin. Lignin kind of coats or covers the cellulose and hemicellulose fractions that are in plants and increases the rigidity of those plant cell walls. So think about lignin as being that steel superstructure of a cell that helps keep the plant upright, which is, of course, quite important for standability of a crop and things of that nature. But whenever you start thinking about taking that feed of that plant and feeding it, the animal has a very difficult time of breaking down lignin, and in fact, it's indigestible for the most part. So, and as lignin levels increase, digestibility decreases. So most of the time, lignin just passes right through because there isn't really any enzyme or amount of time that bacteria have in a gut to break that stuff down very efficiently at all. Think about the amount of time it would take for trees to just simply decompose. And trees are very, very high in lignin, of course. That's why we don't feed them. But it takes a long period of time for a tree to just rot and decompose. It's because the bacteria that are decomposers have a very difficult time breaking through those cell walls of lignin and helping decompose those. But we will feed feeds that are high in lignin or higher in lignin. Think about straw or hay that's gotten mature. It kind of moderates intake levels. It makes the animal expend a little bit of energy in order to digest certain other nutrients in the feed, and therefore kind of manages body weight a little bit. Here's some molecular structures to just show you the simplicity of glucose molecules versus lactose and so on. And again, these are just, this is, while highly related to chemistry, not chemistry class, but I do want to show you the molecular structures just basically so that you understand the more complex it gets, the more energy and heat that it takes to break down those bonds. So we see here on this slide starch that are made of glucose molecule chains, and then you have to break down those chains in order to absorb the glucose molecules. Cellulose that's much more complex yet. Hemicellulose that you see on the left side of your screen here that's even more complex and harder to break down. And then the structure of lignin that's very, very complex and very almost impossible to penetrate and break down in the process of digestion. Now, what do carbohydrates do? They are the main source of energy and heat to your body. So, and really a building block for a lot of other nutrients. So we're going to take carbohydrate and we're going to utilize it to make other things in the body. And of course, if you need extra, your body is quite efficient at storing it for fat. It's one of the only ones that the body will store a large amount of as needed in order for use in another time. And that again, our bodies are made this way so that you can store a little bit of energy in case you come upon a time of nutrient deficiency, so that you have something to convert for energy to kind of tide you over for a little while. So that's why you see animals that will gain weight, is they're storing carbohydrate for some period of time. Your body really doesn't store protein hardly at all. There's obviously some in muscular tissue and things of that nature, and your body will store a little bit of mineral, but doesn't really store anything else in terms of nutrients. So, of course, when we talk about what it does, we also have to think about deficiencies. Two of the main ones that will pop up when you think carbohydrate deficiencies is ketosis and diabetes. Diabetes is obviously much more common in humans and results as a cause of insufficient insulin production in the pancreas, which is sometimes caused by heredity, runs in your family, and of course is sometimes dietary onset diabetic. So that's more common in humans, but when we talk about animals, there's rarely that problem that occurs. Most of the time their deficiency is what we know as ketosis. And so basically an animal that is insufficient, has insufficient carbohydrate intake, will start breaking down protein for energy, which is very, very inefficient. They'll start then losing body weight as they pull off once, and think about this about as they start to lose fat, so they're mobilized all their fat, now they're starting to break down protein. So we're obviously losing body weight. We're decreasing production. And if you think about milk production in particular on a beef cow, dairy cow, any mammal, milk production just tanks, just really plummets as they try and battle with now a carbohydrate shortage. Pregnant animals will sometimes abort, and they'll develop this acetone smell on their breath. And that, really trained, of course, veterinarians and really trained animal handlers can really pick up that smell of acetone. And it's a snowball effect. So once ketosis kind of starts to go, and an animal enters that ketotic state, then they really don't feel like eating, which of course makes all these other things happen that I just mentioned. And that's why it snowballs. So they don't feel like eating. They start to mobilize all these other products out of their body in order to stay alive. And then they really don't feel like eating. And so they start mobilizing more product in order to meet their nutrient needs just through their body. And they really lose more body weight. And it just continues to snowball until you have an animal that probably now has associated other ancillary problems from a health and metabolic perspective. So carbohydrate digestion and metabolism, if we'll look at crude fiber, that's where you'll see this stuff listed on a feed tag. Is crude fiber is cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. Again, kind of your more poorly digested fractions, or nitrogen-free extract, which is your soluble sugars and starches that are readily digested. It's important when we're starting to build rations together, and I'll pause here as I'm getting a little bit near the end of this first segment, but it's important when we build rations to understand that you're going to have both of those probably in a ration at some point in time, and occasionally need both of them in a ration at some point in time for certain purposes. Last but not least is all of these carbohydrates are converted to ATPs, adenosine triphosphate, which is the basic energy currency of the body. Runs everything. So think about, your currency is the dollar. The dollar drives everything for which you purchase and exchange for goods. Just like in the body, the dollar is the ATP, and it costs the body ATP every time the heart beats, the lungs work, digestive systems work, consumption of feed, production output costs some number of ATP. And so carbohydrates are converted to ATPs at a regular basis. You can spend, in digestion and nutrition classes, you could spend a month talking about ATP utilization. We're going to leave it at one slide and just understand that that's the basic currency that the body uses to perform all of its functions, and that will be sufficient for us at this point in time. I'm going to pause there and conclude episode 1 in Unit 1, Nutrients and Digestion. We'll come back and start talking about some of the additional nutrients that we have not covered yet.